Our scripture today will be found in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 51. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded.
This scripture is fascinating because it shows up in the Bible in multiple Gospels. It also seems like a story that got told two different ways and then was told as two separate stories. Can you think of another time you've heard a story of the disciples in a boat with waters that were rocky and Jesus telling them not to be afraid? We have the story of the calming of the storm as well. So in one story, Jesus walks on the water out to them where they're struggling against the waves with the oars. And we have another story where he's in the boat asleep and they freak out and go wake him up. And in both, Jesus has the same response: peace, be still. It's fascinating. Be not afraid. Peace, be still. It's not the first scripture where Jesus has said this, and it's not the first scripture where God has sent a messenger with this, right? For Jesus' birth, the first message we get for Mary, for Joseph, for the shepherds is, don't be afraid. It seems like fear keeps freaking us all out. Whether it's the storms of life churning around us, whether it's looking out and seeing somebody walking on the water, doing things they're not supposed to do, or whether it's expectations of what might come, fear gets us. Fear gets us. There are days where the waters are rocky, where rowing is not easy. These guys were fishermen. This wasn't new to them. But they're at their business. They're dealing with the stuff around them. Jesus is walking out on the water, taking a stroll. It's fascinating. One version says, Jesus intended to walk on by. Where was he going? And they see him, and all of a sudden, wait, we're rowing, we can't get anywhere. Where's Jesus going? Wait, how is Jesus walking on the water? And suddenly the disciples have other things to worry about than what's going on with their oars and their distance from shore. It seems sometimes all we need is something else to pull us out of that muck, pull us out of the freak out. Sometimes we just need something else to focus on. So we notice that what's around us may not be as bad as we thought. Peace, be still. Growing up with young children in the church, sometimes they would teach us things. When Mandy and I were serving a church in Northwest Missouri, the little part of it that sticks out into the straight line states like no one wanted it, that's where we lived. We found out why. That's where they made tornadoes and depression. And then they marketed them to the rest of the country. There were lightning rod factories near us. Every building in town had lightning rods. You have that many storms, it's sad. Our house, which is a parsonage, had 11 lightning rod points between the corners of the home and the garage. Storms were a real thing. Tornadoes were a real thing. If a tornado did not literally touch down on the ground, they did not consider it to have hit them. All the tops of the trees could be missing. If that tornado didn't hit, it just skimmed over. This was a stormy place. They understood what storms were. They also had a tendency to get melodramatic about them. Sometimes it was no big deal, we can handle this. Other times, that storm's a coming, it's gonna be the biggest you've ever seen. It's either famine or flood. My young children are picking up on this a little bit. My daughter, coming out of children's worship one Sunday, had heard one of the stories, and I don't remember if it was this one with Jesus walking on water or the one in the boat. We're sitting at McDonald's, the typical, you were well behaved at church, so you get to go to McDonald's lunch. She has her sweet and sour sauce in the middle, as always, a nugget in one hand and a fry in the other. She's cross-dipping, going back and forth. We asked her what she learned that day, and she's telling us about the disciples and bad weather, and she stops and says, I wonder, when Jesus said, peace be still, was he talking to the storm or the disciples? She was about 7, so she's allowed to ask questions the rest of us think are off limits. Now, the text's pretty clear. In all those instances, Jesus is talking to the storm. But maybe the storm of creation was not the only storm in the boat. Maybe the chaos within them was raging just as much, just as heavily. We understand chaos in the world around us, right? We get it. You turn on the news, and it's not hard to see the chaos caused by Christian nationalism, systemic racism, overt racism, Chinese spy balloons, whatever it is this week that's freaking us all out. As if the absurdity of a pandemic and everything that's gone on politically in the last few years isn't crazy enough, we now have giant balloons floating across the sky. Just another typical day in the news, right? But it stirs stuff in us. Panic, fear, worry, ripples of what could be go across everyone's mind. We get all new fun memes too, right? As we try to cope with the chaos of the world. And then at home, it's easy to get overwhelmed. Sometimes all those world's distractions help draw us away, lift our head up out of the muck we've been in, and the relationship chaos. The vocational chaos, what am I going to do with my life? Oh my gosh, look at the messes I've still not cleaned up. Look at everything I just shoved in a closet from Christmas. Look at the emotions I've just been repressing for 20 years now. What am I going to do with all this? The things that keep us up late, the things that wake us up early, quickly become chaotic concerns as soon as we're triggered again. Chaos, confusion, and fear. These are characters in our world's history. And they are characters we know well in our own life, right? Some of us are very structured. We keep the chaos and the clutter confined to its lane as best we can, and we exhaust ourselves making sure it doesn't escape. So much so we sometimes don't get to enjoy the rest. Others of us let the chaos loose so much we can't escape it. Chaos and fear, pain and panic, they're with us a lot. Historically, these have manifestations in different mythology as characters. Some of you, whether it's playing Dungeons and Dragons, Serena, or Xavier in mythology, and others of you who are literature students may have picked up these characters along the way. In Greek mythology and tradition, Deimos and Phobos were literally pain and panic. Disney put them to animation in the Hercules movie. Hades' sidekicks, who Hades occasionally literally kicks. They come into the story, but I think they're in our scripture story too. I think the disciples know them well. This struggle, pain, of panic. But a character that might have been more common in the mythology of the day was Tiamat. And I love watching a couple of you who are mythology folks just nodding your heads now. Yes, Tiamat, we get to talk about the big monster. For those who have played different mythology games, Tiamat is often pictured as a multi-headed dragon. If you watch the old Dungeons and Dragons cartoon in the 80s, that's what was the big monster they showed that the kids from our world had to go fight. But Tiamat's a character known throughout the Mesopotamian history. They think maybe originally Akkadian, they're not sure. Tiamat comes up lots of places. The name gets translated and the word gets adapted into different languages. And it's the same word used for the seas in Hebrew. For the seas. Tiamat was a goddess of chaos and creation. Tiamat traditionally laid down their body to form the oceans and becomes the mother of other deities. Tiamat's a name that was known in different cultures, and the word in Hebrew for the seas, where the churning, the chaos is upsetting the disciples, upon the Tiamat. And Jesus is walking on it. Now let's take this metaphor a little further. Jesus is taking a walk on the ancient deities. Jesus is out for a stroll on the legends of history. And they don't pull him down. They don't knock him over. Jesus is both human, as the early church tells this story, and one who can tread on Tiamat without fear. And in the midst of chaos, while cruising across the chaos, Jesus looks at us and says, "Chill out." Remember, there's another story where Jesus even tells Peter, "Come on out with me, the water's fine. Take your own step out into the chaos. Come tame Tiamat with me." It's interesting. It's not your religious history are bad and evil. We've done that in the church with other people's cultural deities all over the place. This is more of the early church using a cultural story that was known throughout the region to try to say, but what Jesus does is bigger than our legends of that. Beyond Tiamat, beyond pain and panic, Jesus is one who meets it with our humanity and fragility, and also with the grandeur and mystery of God. Can we explain it? No, it's a mystery. Are we big enough to wrangle Tiamat ourselves? Probably not, but Jesus says, "Come on out, I'll meet you here, the water's fine." And as we sit where we are, overwhelmed by what's going on, Jesus says, in the midst of where you are, peace. Just be still. Stop rocking your own boat. One of the most common prayers, I think one of the places that people identify with Jesus most, is his prayer in the garden. My God, why have you forsaken me?" A place where the chaos starts to swirl again. And you see Jesus start to struggle with it. But God responds to Jesus in that moment as God responds to us, as Jesus responds to the disciples in the story. Peace, be still. Echoing the sentiment of angels to the Holy Family. Echoing God's call to God's people throughout. Come to me. Make room for me. And all will be fine. There's never been a time of peace and tranquility in our world free from war somewhere. We've just not known about it. There's never been an era without a natural disaster. There's never been a life lived that was not touched by pain and panic at some point. Yet we go on shouting at the heavens and at each other in hopes of a peaceable kingdom. As if we shout it loud enough or impose our will heavy enough, we'll be able to force the chaos to do what we want it to do. Jesus doesn't try to reshape the seas. Jesus just walks over it, moves on, goes for a stroll, and trusts that it will not suck him down. If we go on shouting at the heavens and each other, all we do is stir the seas. All we do is tempt Tiamat. So whether Jesus is talking to the disciples or Jesus is talking to us, Jesus is speaking to the chaos around us. Words that are helpful, words that are prophetic. Maybe when we calm ourselves, we can tell our fear and chaos to be still. Maybe when we calm ourselves, we can be the stable point that others can turn their gaze to help them find their own balance. Maybe when we calm ourselves, we can bring peace to those who have just been upended by the storms of life, those who are now flooded by grief, those who are being pulled under by tides of violence. If we calm ourselves, if we look up and see Jesus strolling across the chaos of capitalism, silencing the storms of hate speech, taking a nap through prosperity gospel sermons, knowing they have no influence on the grand scheme of things, then we can bring peace to our own hearts. They can help us, instead of living in the chaos, soak in the mystery of God. Instead of being upended by the storm, help us float in the reassurance of God's care and God's grace. We start calming the storms within. It can help us live as God made us, without shame, without fear. And once we've calmed the storms within, we can start walking on the water around us. Amen.